Hi there. I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Our show today is about the vote, the guardian of our system of self-governance. Miles Rapoport is with us. He teaches democratic governance and innovation at Harvard's Kennedy School. We live in a time where the preservation of democracy and democratic values is foremost in our consciousness. The public is vitally concerned, not only with issues of political gerrymandering and voter suppression, but also with issues bearing on the legitimacy of the vote itself. Along with Washington Post syndicated columnist E.J. Dionne, Miles has written a compelling book entitled 100% Democracy, in which he offers a solution convincingly making the case for universal voting. We're delighted to welcome Miles Rapoport to the program. Well, congratulations on your book, 100% Democracy.
Thank you, Jim, and I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. Now, in your book, you say you want to change the paradigm of democracy. Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, I have been working on issues of voting rights and expanding democracy for about 40 years. When I was in the state legislature in Connecticut, Secretary of the State, and then at Demos, and since the last 5 years at the Kennedy School. And, we've made some progress towards voting, and of course there are a lot of people who are trying to roll it back. But the question is, how can we really reach a fully participatory democracy? And that's I think, the paradigm that we're looking for. E.G. and I believe that democracy is best when everyone participates, and it is possible to enact some policies that would help us really get there.
Well, we'll get into that, but in the last presidential election, I think 160 million people voted, which was 67% of those eligible. I mean, isn't that good enough? I mean, is the system broken? And if it's broken, why are you trying to fix it?
Well, actually, it's interesting. If you look at the last two elections, the 2018 midterms and the 2020 presidential election, both of them were record turnouts. In 2018, we had the largest turnout in midterm elections in probably over 100 years, and that was 50.3%. And 2020, which was actually a tremendous achievement given the pandemic, given that there were 400 lawsuits, tremendous fighting over how the voting was going to be allowed. And you're right, we had over 160 million people participate, and it was 66.2% of the electorate. So on the one hand, I'm glad we have done better than we've done before, but those figures really aren't anything to write home about. And when you compare them internationally, I think there's a lot of room for improvement, and that's what we'd like to see.
But isn't it true that where the public sees space between the candidates, they tend to come out and vote? And if they think the candidates are about the same and they're kind of boring, they just stay home. And there are too many other things to do rather than wait online to cast a vote.
Well, there are a lot of reasons why people don't vote. I think in part they do feel like government is not responsive. Sometimes they don't feel like there's a real difference, or they don't like either of the candidates, and that's true. We also make it fairly hard for people to vote in comparison to other advanced democracies. I just want to take Australia as an example. They really work, the National Election Commission in Australia does a tremendous amount of work to get people registered and onto the rolls. And then, as our book says, since 1924, they have made it a requirement for people to vote. And they get 90% turnout in every election. And people don't complain about it. They like the system, and I think we ought to emulate that here.
Well, they've done that for 100 years. Now, what do you mean by requirement? You mean if I don't vote, they're going to put me in jail for not voting?
No, not in jail. But if you don't vote, if you're registered to vote in Australia, and 96.3% of the people are actually registered and on the rolls, and you don't vote, they send you a note after the election saying, hey, Jim, how come you didn't vote? And if you offer almost any excuse, I was in Perth visiting my grandmother, or I had to work that day, that's accepted.
The dog ate my homework.
The dog ate your homework. I suppose you could say that too.
But if you have any excuse, will do. I mean, what's the whole point?
Well, the point is that it's a reminder that participation is an expected obligation. And if you don't give any excuse whatsoever, you get fined $20. That's the enforcement mechanism, which is about $15 in U.S. So it's a kind of light touch enforcement, but nevertheless, they have constructed and created a civic culture where people expect that they're going to vote, and they do vote. And so it's worked out fairly well. I think we're in a kind of a difficult and sometimes vicious cycle where people don't participate. Government is therefore not very responsive to the people who don't participate. It's more responsive to regular voters and, of course, to the donors. And then that alienates people further. What we're hoping to do, E.J. Dionne and I in the book, is to create a virtuous circle where if we start with universal participation and it becomes a civic obligation, like jury duty, I'll point out, then I think government is more responsive, people feel like there's more at stake, and hopefully you start a kind of upward cycle. That's what we're hoping for.
Well, is there a constitutional issue? I mean, aren't you really forcing me to express an opinion by forcing me to go to the polls and vote?
We had a working group that was a joint effort of the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Brookings Institution. And we had a terrific group of people that did it, including 5 or 6 top-notch constitutional lawyers who looked at this issue very, very carefully. And the answer is no. We're not compelling speech because you don't have to vote for anyone if you're compelled to vote for a particular candidate or even to choose a candidate. But you can submit a blank ballot. You can write in Jim Zirin as a candidate, or frankly, you can write in none of the above. And our recommendation for the United States, if we do it, is that we have a none of the above option to make it very clear that you are not being compelled to speak, you're being compelled to participate. And I want to just mention the jury duty analogy because I think it's very important.
One thing about the jury duty analogy that, in my view, doesn't quite hold up is that the right to trial by jury is expressly stated in the Constitution. There's nothing about voting in the Constitution. At least the Constitution was kind of designed to insulate the government from the people because there was no direct election of senators until, 100 or more years ago. Women couldn't vote. They did vote directly for the Congress, not for the House of Representatives. And people didn't vote directly for the president. They voted for electors who in turn elected the president.
We've had a very long journey, as you point out, towards full participation from the beginning when it was only white men of property who could vote, and then gradually the system has opened up. But I want to go back to the jury duty analogy. It's not constitutionally exact, but philosophically I think it's exact because the reason that we want everyone to serve on a jury, and it's become commonplace. Nobody thinks, oh my God, how dare they make me serve on a jury? It's what we're used to, is because you want the decisions about guilt and innocence and proper punishment to be made by as fully reflective a pool writ large of jurors as possible. I think the same thing applies to voting. I think we should want the decisions of government and the people who are going to make those decisions to be selected by the fullest reflection of the population of the United States. That's our goal. It's consent of all the governed. I think it's in the spirit of the Constitution, even though we haven't lived up to it very well.
But what is the virtue necessarily of increasing the quantity of people who vote? I mean, shouldn't we be trying to increase the quality, to get people who are informed about government, informed about the issues, informed about the candidates to come to the polls? I mean, this is what seems to be lacking, not just the raw numbers of people who come to polls and vote.
But the problem is that participation and non-participation is not evenly distributed. If it were, you might be able to make a case that it doesn't matter whether it's 90% or 70%. But what happens now is that young people are disproportionately not voting. Communities of color, people are disproportionately not voting. People with low incomes or low education. And what you get is an electorate that is skewed towards higher income, higher educated, and frankly, a whiter population than the population as a whole. And the decisions of government then reflect that. So I think that there would be better representation and fuller representation if everybody from all walks of life were participating.
Well, have studies been made as to why these groups aren't voting? Why aren't black people voting? Why they have a tremendous stake in our society? Why aren't young people voting? I mean, they're our future. Why are they sitting it out?
Well, there are many, many studies that and a multiplicity of reasons. Actually, I should say, though, that turnout in the black community now has risen significantly over the last 15, 20 years, and is now very close to what white participation is. Latinx population and Asian population are still lower, and young people are really the kind of least represented. Some of it is, I never use the word apathy. I have never used the word apathy. Some of it is that people don't see a reason to vote. Some of it is that we put up roadblocks. If you need 30 days advance notice to register to vote and you've just moved somewhere new, you're shut out of the system. There are lots of hurdles that we put up. So what EJ and I have talked about in the book is there are a series of gateway reforms that enable people to vote more easily. Same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, pre-registering high school students when they're 16 and 17, and then they can automatically vote when they're 18. And all those are reforms that we think are good, and we think they've made a difference. But we also think that the ultimate kind of North Star reform, that's how we're putting it out. We're putting it out as a North Star reform, is for everyone to participate.
The Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail, but it's not a holy grail in the sense that both Australia and 25 other democratic countries around the globe use some form of universal voting.
But they also have a much smaller population. I mean, we have a population in the United States of about 300 million, and I don't know how many are eligible to vote. Some of them are below voting age.
Right.
Right.
And there's around 220 million people.
But as compared with
eligible.
Australia, we have a huge population. And seems it would be very difficult to enforce a rule that everyone who's eligible has to come out and vote.
Listen, we enforce the jury requirement. We enforce the fact that parents have to educate their children to 16, either by sending them to school or meeting standards for homeschooling. We require people to pay taxes, and we have a very, very set up system to do that. I think we could do this. I think we could do it easily. I think, by the way, one of the advantages of thinking about everyone voting and everyone being required to vote is that we would then, I think, be duty-bound to create a better election administration system than the one we have now, which is very kind of catch-as-catch-can in many, many places, and some states are better than others, some cities are better than others. A national system that would work better to do this, I think, would be a great step to improve it.
Well, would this be a state-by-state system and regime, or would it require acts of Congress to have a uniform national rule that everyone has to vote?
That's a very, very good question. The answer is all of the above. It could be enacted by Congress, and in fact, Congressman John Larson from Connecticut has put in a bill called the Civic Duty to Vote Act, there is a bill in Congress. But our expectation is that it'll be adopted by states. State legislatures clearly have the authority to set the terms and conditions of voting for their state offices and for congressional and Senate elections as well. But it also could be done by municipalities. If municipalities, sometimes they might need some form of state permission, but if municipalities adopted it, I think that could be a good stepping stone, both for cities and states to kind of exercise their role as the laboratories of democracy, as Justice Brandeis said.
Yes, he did. Now, but what about that? If people are voting universally and 100% democracy in some states and 50% democracy in other states, you have a very uneven kind of election process.
Well, I hope if 100% democracy and full voting works in some states, I hope that it'll motivate the other states to follow suit. And interestingly, let's just take a state like Michigan. If Detroit and Grand Rapids were to adopt universal voting and therefore increase their vote substantially, I would think that the rest of the state would want to get on board and make sure they're fully represented as well. So I think there might be a kind of a leveraging effect if some municipalities adopt it.
Well, here's a practical question. I mean, is there any hope of getting this proposal adopted? I saw a poll recently that only 20% of those polled thought it was a good idea.
Well, E.J. Dionne likes to say that we're either the most honest book writers or the dumbest, because we put the poll right in our book that says that as of right now, 26% of the population supports it. So we know we have a good hill to climb. But here's what I think. This idea, even though it has 100 years of proof of concept in Australia, just to take that example, has never been seriously discussed in this country. And what we're trying to do by putting out 100% Democracy, the Case for Universal Voting as a book, is to get the idea into the public domain, start to get people talking about it, and we think we've done that to some degree already. And then I think as people start to discuss it, I think it's going to pick up support. We definitely have had people who have come to our events during our book tour, who came up to us afterwards as we were signing the books and said, I was very skeptical coming in, but you've persuaded me. So I think that support will build if we have a real discussion about it, and that's our intention.
Well, I traveled recently, and I met a woman from Texas in the fitness center of my hotel.
Okay.
And we started talking politics a little bit, and I said, "Who's your next governor?" And she said, "Mister, we got problems." And I floated the idea of universal voting, and I thought that'd be a good way to start a conversation. And she said, "I don't want the government to tell me to do anything." Now, that's an attitude that isn't unique to this woman. This is an attitude that seems to prevail in lots of places in the country, even in the so-called blue states like New York and Massachusetts, where you spend your time.
Well, there certainly will be opposition. There's no question about it. And the people who have that fierce libertarianism of don't tell me to do anything, don't tell me to wear a mask, even if it's going to save my life, they may not support this. But in the same poll, where we found that only 26% of the people were supportive, 61% of the people, both Republicans and Democrats, said that they thought voting was both a right and a duty. So I think there's that sort of sense of civic duty that we can also build on. So I think while some people will never be persuaded, I think there are some places that we might be able to get this passed and see if we can roll it out from there.
So, I mean, just to be a little bit partisan, the latest figures on the registration for the midterms is that Democratic registration is off, Republican registration is up, which at least gives us a hint that the control of the House of Representatives is going to flip in the midterms. And aren't you worried that if you have many more people voting, you might have people voting for bad candidates who believe that Trump stole the election?
This is a point that is really important, both to EJ and myself, and that is that we are not presenting this as a way to get more Democrats with a large D elected. We think this is a fundamental issue of democracy. Do we want people to vote and fully participate in the democracy, or don't we? And yes, there are some cases where there's no question that a high turnout, look at the Virginia elections that they just did last November, might help the Republicans. But that's not our point. Our point is that whether it helps the Republicans or the Democrats in any given election, the democracy, our nation as a whole, I think, is benefited by universal participation. And I'll say this, I think the nature of campaigns would change for the better. Right now, and I ran 11 campaigns when I was in politics in Connecticut, the whole goal is to identify your supporters and then get them out to the polls. It's all about turnout. It's not about persuasion. It's about turnout. And that means that you sort of can enrage to engage. You just get your turnout out, your troops out, and then you, in the worst case scenario, you try to depress the turnout of your opponents. And I think that's no way to run an airline. If you know that everybody's going to vote, and therefore everybody is listening all the time, you've got to craft a message that's going to appeal to everybody. And I think that will have a healthy impact in sort of not eliminating the polarization that we're facing now, but maybe bringing it down a little bit, because you have to appeal to everybody, not just your super partisan Democrats or Republicans.
Well, let's take Australia, which is your paradigm. I spoke to a former Prime Minister of Australia, and he told me lots of people come to the polls and say, "You're all a bunch of jackasses," and then leave. I mean, are you really, perhaps I asked you this, but are you really optimistic you can improve the quality, that people are going to listen to the arguments and consider the virtues and vices of the candidates, if you'll get a better outcome?
There have been several studies in Australia that when people know that they are required to vote, they actually do take the time to familiarize themselves with when and how it is. Of course, there's a big push of public education to make sure that everybody knows when and how to vote. And they familiarize themselves with the candidates. Again, they don't automatically become a college professor, et cetera. But there is clearly an indication that that does help encourage voters to inform themselves. So yeah, I think if we have a full participation and everyone knows it's their civic responsibility to vote, I think we'll get better voters. I think we'll get better campaigns, and ultimately, I think we'll get a better democracy. By the way, people have called us kind of naive optimists here, and I plead guilty. Look, we have a lot of threats to our democracy and a lot of bad things that are poised to potentially happen, and those things need to be fought, and we're not naive in that regard. But I also think it's important to dream a little bit. That song resonates in my head, Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow. You know, I think that we also ought to be thinking broadly about what we'd like to see, assuming that we can get through the current crisis. And what I'd like to see, and I think a lot of people would like to see, is a genuinely, fully participatory democracy. And that ought to be our North Star and our goal.
Well, the pollsters went out not too long ago and asked questions like, can you name a single justice of the Supreme Court? And more than any justice presently sitting or sitting in the past on the bench, the answer was Judge Judy. So you take that person and you say, all right, you're required to vote, pal. And they go to the polls and they cast their vote. What kind of quality are you getting in the electorate?
Well, there are a lot of people voting now that would name Judge Judy. I don't actually know that there's a major distinction between people who do vote and don't vote in terms of their level of knowledge. What there is a clear difference is that people who are more motivated to vote now are more ideological, and the people who don't vote are kind of less ideological, less kind of fired up about one position or another. That doesn't mean that they're less informed. So, again, it's sort of a little bit of an article of faith. Yes, of course, are there voters who are kind of not really knowledgeable on what they're doing? Yes, and there always have been and there are now. Do I think that if everybody votes, we'll get a better set of voters? I can't say for sure, but I think that there's a real, it's a little bit like crowdsourcing, which is the more you have in a crowdsourcing pool, the more likely you are to get to a good outcome. And I believe that's true in voting as well.
Well, what about this issue that Donald Trump has raised of fraud, voter fraud, fraud in voter machines, harvesting of votes, destroying ballots, dead people voting? And he tested that out in probably more than 60 lawsuits, and he didn't win one of them.
Correct.
Now, is that dynamic going to change at all if you have universal voting, 100% democracy? They'll still make allegations of fraud, and they'll still say that the election was stolen.
Yes. I mean, the allegations of fraud have been made, since I was Secretary of the State 25 years ago. I think they've been largely bogus, and they have largely been a cover argument for making it more difficult for people to vote, on the theory that somehow if you make it more difficult for people to vote, one party or another, I think the Republican Party has been pushing this line certainly more forcefully than most Democrats, then you'll win. But you're right. There were 60 lawsuits alleging fraud. None of them were upheld. There have been, recounts and audits of all kinds since then. The actual numbers of people who go and vote in a fraudulent manner is absolutely minuscule. It's been shown time and time again. So that doesn't surprise me that Donald Trump continues to echo it, because he doesn't feel bound by accuracy. We know that. But I think that for most serious scholars of voting, the issue of voter fraud is not a real one. And if we have good election administration, so right now we have election administration, I'll just make this point quickly, that is underfunded, is partisan, is balkanized. You have different counties and different places doing it in different ways. In Australia and almost every other democracy in the world, you have a highly professionalized national election administration that sets standards, that is properly funded, that is highly effective. And the elections run much better. So I think if we have better election administration, whatever fraud there is will actually be cut down. But it's been a non-issue since it's been raised.
Okay, well, Miles Rapoport, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Do you think we're ever going to achieve in the United States of America 100% democracy?
Well, I'll end with the story that EJ always tells, which is that right now we vote by secret ballot. And we wouldn't imagine voting any other way. We wouldn't imagine going and announcing our vote at the polling place. But it was not always so. In the 1800s and even into the early 1900s, Americans voted with a party ticket. And so everybody came and showed which ticket you were voting for, and everybody knew how you voted. Finally, the secret ballot began to be discussed. It was resisted, and it was passed. And what was it called? It was called the Australian ballot. And 100 years later, it's just the way it is. So our hope and prediction is that 50 years from now, everybody will be voting, we'll have universal voting, and another idea that we import from Australia, and people will say, how is it that we ever did it another way? So yes, I think we'll have it.
So Australia is our paradigm.
It's not a bad paradigm. There are others, but it's not a bad one.
Not a bad paradigm. So well, thank you so much for coming by. We've come to the end of our program. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. Please visit our website at jimzirinconversations.com, and take care, be well, and all the best. I'm Jim Zirin.